This is Part 7, Volume 1 of the new and complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Particulars respecting Arundel Cooke, Esquire, and John Woodburne, who were hanged for cutting and maiming Mr. Crisp. These people suffered on what is called the Coventry Act, to understand which it will be necessary to recite a few particulars. The Coventry Act took its rise from the following circumstance. Sir John Coventry, in the reign of Charles II, having oppofed the measures of the court in the House of Commons, in revenge hereof, some armed villains attacked him one night in Covent Garden, slit his nose, and cut off his lips. Shocked by so barbarous a deed, the members of both houses of Parliament passed an act in a few days, by which it was ordered that unlawful cutting out, or disabling the tongue, of malice aforethought, or by lying in wait, putting out an eye, slitting the nose or lip, or cutting off or disabling any limb or member of any person, with intent to maim or disfigure, shall be felony without benefit of clergy. By this law it was likewise enacted that accessories shall be deemed principals. The parties whose crimes we are about to relate are the first who were executed on this act. Mr. Cooke was born near Bury St. Edmunds in the county of Suffolk. His father was a man of fortune, and when he had given him an university education, he sent him to the Temple to study the law, after which he was called to the bar, and acted as a counsellor. After some time he married a young lady, the sister of Mr. Crisp, who lived in the neighbourhood of his native place. Mr. Crisp, being a gentleman of large property, but a bad state of health, made his will in favour of Cooke, subject only to a jointure for his sister's use, which was likewise to become the property of the counsellor, in case the lady died before her husband. It was not long after Mr. Crisp had made his will before he recovered his health in some degree, but he continued an infirm man, though he lived a number of years. This partial recovery gave great uneasiness to Cooke, who, wishing to possess the estate, was anxious for the death of his brother-in-law, though, as he had art enough to conceal his sentiments, they appeared to live on tolerable terms. However, he at length grew so impatient that he could not come into possession by death of Mr. Crisp, that he resolved to remove him by murder, and for that purpose engaged John Woodburne, a labouring man, who had 6 children, to assist him in the execution of this diabolical plan. For this piece of service he promised to give Woodburne £100. The man was unwilling to be concerned in this execrable business, but reflections on his poverty and the largeness of his family tempted him to comply. On this it was agreed that the murder should be perpetrated on Christmas evening, and as Mr. Crisp was to dine with Mr. Cooke on that day, and the churchyard lay between one house and the other, Woodburne was to wait concealed behind one of the tombstones till Cooke gave him the signal for the attack, which was to be a loud whistle. Crisp came to his appointment, and dined and drank tea with his brother-in-law, but declining to stay for supper, he left the house about 9 o'clock, and was almost immediately followed into the churchyard by Cooke, who, giving the agreed signal to Woodburne, the latter quitted his place of retreat, knocked down the unhappy man, and cut and maimed him in a terrible manner, in which he was abetted by the counsellor. Imagining that they had dispatched him, Mr. Cooke rewarded Woodburne with a few shillings, and instantly went home. But he had not been arrived more than a quarter of an hour before Crisp knocked at the door, and entered covered with wounds, and almost dead through loss of blood. He was unable to speak, but by his looks seemed to accuse Cooke with the intent of murder, and was then put to bed and his wounds dressed by a surgeon. At the end of about a week he was so much mended as to be removed to his own house. He had no doubt but Cooke was one of the persons who had assaulted him, but had resolved not to speak of the affair till future circumstances made it necessary for him to inform a court of justice of what had happened. The intended assassination having greatly engaged the attention of the neighbours, Woodburne was apprehended on suspicion. When making a discovery of the whole truth, Cooke was also taken into custody. They were brought to their trials at the next assizes, when both of them were convicted. When they were called up to receive sentence of death, Cooke desired to be heard, and the court complying with his request, he urged that, quote, judgment could not pass on the verdict because the Act of Parliament simply mentions an intention to maim or deface, whereas he was firmly resolved to have committed murder. End quote. He quoted several law cases in favour of the arguments he had advanced, and hoped that judgment might be respited till the opinion of the 12 judges could be taken on the cause. The counsel for the Crown opposed the arguments of Mr. Cooke, insisted that the crime came within the meaning of the law, and hoped that judgment would pass against the prisoners. Lord Chief Justice King, who presided on this occasion, declared that he could not admit the force of Mr. Cooke's plea consistent with his own oath as a judge, quote, for, he said, it would establish a principle in the law inconsistent with the first dictates of natural reason. As the greatest villain might, when convicted of a smaller offence, plead that the judgment must be arrested because he intended to commit a greater. In the present instance, said he, judgment cannot be arrested, as the intention is naturally implied when the crime is actually committed. His lordship said that Crisp was assassinated in the manner laid in the indictment. It is therefore to be taken for granted that the intention was to maim and deface, wherefore the court will proceed to give judgment, and accordingly sentence of death was passed on the prisoners. After condemnation, Cooke employed his time principally in endeavours to procure a pardon, and when he found his expectations failed him, he grew reserved, and would not admit even the visits of his friends. On the contrary, Woodburne was all penitence and contrition, sincerely lamenting the crime he had been guilty of, and the miserable situation in which he left his poor children. A short time before the day of execution, Cooke wrote to the sheriff, requesting that he might be hanged in the night, to prevent his being exposed to the country people who were expected from all the adjacent towns and villages, and in consequence hereof he was hanged at 4 o'clock in the morning, and Woodburne was executed the afternoon of the same day. The latter behaved with every sign of penitence, but Cooke's conduct was very unfeeling, and he absolutely refused to confess his crime. These malefactors were executed at Bury St. Edmunds on the 5th of April, 1722. Narrative of the remarkable actions of John Hawkins and George Simpson, who were executed for robbing the Bristol mail and hung in chains. As the crime for which these malefactors suffered is very pernicious in its own nature, and their other transactions made a great noise in the world at the time they took place, we propose to give a particular account of them. John Hawkins was the son of a poor farmer at Staines, who not being able to afford to educate him properly, he went into service of a gentleman, which he soon quitted, and lived as a waiter at the Red Lion at Brentford, but leaving this place, he again engaged as a gentleman's servant. After living in different families, he became butler to Sir Dennis Drury, and was distinguished as a servant of very creditable appearance. Indeed, his person was uncommonly graceful, and he was remarkably vain of it. He used to frequent gaming tables 2 or 3 nights in the week, a practice which led to that ruin which finally befell him. About this time Sir Dennis had been robbed of a considerable quantity of plate, and as Hawkins' mode of life was very expensive, it was suspected that he was the thief, for which reafon he was difcharged without the advantage of a good character. Being thus deftitute of the means of fubfiftence, he had recourfe to the highway, and his firft expedition was to Hounslow Heath, where he took £11 from the paffengers in a coach. But fuch was his attachment to gaming, that he repaired directly to London, where he loft it all. He continued to rob alone for fome time, lofing at the gaming houfes what he obtained at fo much rifk, and he then engaged to rob with other highwaymen. But the fame fate ftill attended him. He loft by gaming what he got by thieving, and was frequently fo reduced as to dine at an eating houfe, and then fneak off without paying his reckoning. Several of Hawkins' old companions having met their deferts at the gallows, he became acquainted with one Wilfon, a youth of good education, who had been articled to a folicitor in Chancery, but had neglected his bufinefs through an attachment to the gaming tables. Thofe affociates having committed feveral robberies in conjunction, were tried for one of them, but acquitted for want of evidence, though Wilfon, in an account published after Hawkins' condemnation, confefles they were guilty. Immediately after this, Wilfon went down to his mother, who lived at Whitby in Yorkshire, and continued with her for about a year, and then coming to London, lived with a gentleman of the law, but having loft his money in gaming, renewed his acquaintance with Hawkins, who was now concerned with a new gang of villains. But one of thefe being apprehended, impeached the reft, which foon difperfed the gang, but not till fome of them had made their exit at Tyburn, on which Hawkins was obliged to conceal himfelf for a considerable time, but at length he ventured to rob a gentleman on Finchley Common, and fhot one of the fervants, fo that he died on the fpot. His next attack was on the Earl of Burlington and Lord Bruce, in Richmond Lane, from whom he took about £20, 2 gold watches, and a sapphire ring. For this ring a reward of £100 was offered to Jonathan Wild, but Hawkins failed to Holland with it, and there fold it for £40. Hawkins, returning to England, joined his companions, of whom Wilfon was one, and robbed Sir David Dalrymple of £3, a fnuff box, and a pocket book, for which last Sir David offered £60 reward to Wild. But the robbers, having no connection with that execrable villain, who did not even know their perfons, they fent the book by a porter to Sir David without expence. Hawkins and his associates next ftopped Mr. Hyde of Hackney in his coach, and robbed him of £10 and his watch, but missed £300, which the gentleman then had in his poffeffion. After this they stopped the Earl of Westmoreland's coach in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and robbed him of a fum of money, though there were 3 footmen behind the carriage. The footman called the watch, but the robbers firing a piftol over their heads, the guardians of the night decamped. Hawkins had now resolved to carry the booty obtained in feveral late robberies to Holland, but Jonathan Wild, having heard of the connection, caufed fome of the gang to be apprehended, on which the reft went into the country to hide themfelves. On this occasion Hawkins and Wilfon went to Oxford, and paying a visit to the Bodleian Library, the former wantonly defaced fome pictures in the gallery, and £100 reward was offered to discover the offender, and a poor tailor, being taken up on fufpicion, narrowly efcaped being whipped, merely becaufe he was of Whiggifh principles. Wilfon and Hawkins returning to London, and the former coming of age at that time, fucceeded to a little eftate his father had left him, which he sold for £350, a fmall part of which he lent to his companions to buy horfes, and foon dissipated the reft at the gaming table. The associates now stopped 2 gentlemen in a chariot on Hampstead Road, who both fired at once, by which 3 slugs were lodged in Hawkins' shoulder, and the highwaymen got to London with fome difficulty. On Hawkins' recovery, they attempted to stop a gentleman's coach in Hyde Park, but the coachman driving haftily, Wilfon fired, and wounding himself in the hand, found it difficult to scale the park wall to effect his escape. This circumstance occafioned fome ferious thoughts in his mind, in confequence of which he fet out for his mother's houfe in Yorkshire, where he was kindly received, and fully determined never to return to his former practices. While he was engaged in his mother's bufinefs, and planning fchemes for domeftic happinefs, he was fent for to a public houfe, where he found his old acquaintance Hawkins in company with George Simpson, of whom we fhall have occafion to relate more in the courfe of this narrative. Wilfon was fhocked at feeing them, and asked what could induce them to make fuch a journey. Hereupon Hawkins fwore violently, faid Wilfon was impeached, and would be taken into cuftody in a few days. This induced him to go to London with them, but on his arrival he found that the ftory of the impeachment was falfe. When in London they formed connexions with other thieves, and committed feveral robberies, for which fome of the gang were executed. They frequented a public houfe at London Wall, the mafter of which kept a livery stable, fo that they rode out at all hours, and robbed the ftages as they were coming into town. They took not only money, but portmanteaus, and &c., and divided the booty with Carter, the mafter of the livery stable. In this practice they continued a considerable time, till they were apprehended for robbing the mail, which we fhall have occafion to mention in the fequel. George Simpson was a native of Putney in Surrey. His father was a wine merchant, but being reduced in circumstances, removed to Lincolnshire. Young Simpson kept a public houfe at Lincoln, and acted as a fheriff's officer, but quitting the country, he came to London, and was butler to Lord Castlemaine, after which he lived in feveral other credible places. He now became acquainted with Hawkins, in company with whom he stopped the carriage of Richard West, Esquire, behind Buckingham Houfe, from whom they took a gold watch and other valuable articles. Soon after this he robbed the Portsmouth coach in company with Wilfon, when one of the company fired at them. Thus they continued their depredations on the public, till one of their associates, named Child, was executed at Aylesbury, and hung in chains for robbing the mail. This incensed them to fuch a degree, that they determined to revenge the fuppofed infult by committing a fimilar crime. They mentioned their defign in the prefence of Carter, the stable keeper, who advifed them to ftop the mail from Harwich; but this they declined, becaufe the changing of the wind muft render the time of its arrival uncertain. At length it was determined that they would rob the Bristol mail, and they fet out on an expedition for that purpofe. It appeared on the trail that the boy who carried the mail was overtaken at Slough by a countryman who travelled with him to Langley Broom, where a perfon rode up to them and turned back again. After paffing through Colnbrook, they faw the fame man again, with two others, who followed them at a fmall diftance, and then, pulling their wigs over their foreheads, and holding handkerchiefs in their mouths, came up with them, and commanded the poft boy and the countryman to come down a lane, where they ordered them to quit their horfes, and then Hawkins, Simpson, and Wilfon tied them back to back, and faftened them to a tree in a wet ditch, fo that they were obliged to stand in the water. This being done, they took fuch papers as they liked out of the Bath and Bristol bags, and hid the rest in a hedge. They now croffed the Thames, and riding a little way into Surrey, put up their horfes at an inn in Bermondsey Street. It was now about 6 in the morning, when they parted, and went different ways to a public houfe in the Minories, where they proposed to divide their ill-gotten treafure. The landlord, being acquainted with the perfons, and knowing the profeffion of his guefts, fhewed them a private room, and fupplied them with pen and ink. Having equally divided the bank notes, they threw the letters in the fire, and then went to their lodgings at Green Arbour Court in the Old Bailey. A few days after this transaction they were taken into cuftody in the following manner. Information having been given at the poft office that fufpicious people frequented the houfe of Carter, the stable keeper at London Wall, some perfons were fent thither to make the neceffary difcoveries. Wilfon, happening to be there at the time, fufpected their bufinefs, on which he abruptly retired, flipped through fome by alleys, and got into the Moorgate coffee houfe, which he had occafionally ufed 2 years before, on account of its being frequented by reputable company, and therefore lefs liable to be fearched for fufpicious people. He had not been long in the houfe before a Quaker mentioned the fearch that was making in the neighbourhood for the men who robbed the mail. This fhocked him, fo that he instantly paid his reckoning, and going out the back door, went into Bedlam, where the melancholy fight of the objects around him induced him to draw a comparifon between their fituation and his own. And he concluded that he was far more unhappy through weight of his guilt than thofe poor wretches whom it had pleafed God to deprive of the ufe of their intellects. Having reflected that it would not be fafe for him to stay longer in London, he resolved to go to Newcastle by the Sea, and he was confirmed in this refolution on reflecting that a perfon who wifhed his fafety had informed him that he and his companions were the parties fufpected of having robbed the mail. This friend likewife advifed him to go to the poft office, furrender, and turn evidence, hinting that, if he did not, it was probable Simpson would, as he had asked fome queftions which feemed to intimate fuch a defign. Wilfon neglected this advice, but held his refolution of going to Newcastle, and with that intention quitted Bedlam. But by Moorgate coffee houfe he met the men he had feen at Carter's. They turned and followed him, yet unperceived by them he entered the coffee houfe, while they went under the arch of the gate, and if he had returned by the door he entered, he would have again efcaped them, but going out of the fore door of the houfe, they took him into cuftody, and conducted him to the poft office. On his firft examination he refufed to make any confeffion. On the following day he feemed equally determined to conceal the truth, till 2 circumftances induced him to reveal it. In the firft place, the Poftmaster General promised that he should be admitted an evidence if he would difcover his accomplices, and one of the clerks, calling him afide, fhewed him a letter without any name to it, of which the following is a copy. Quote, Sir, I am one of thofe perfons who robbed the mails, which I am forry for, and, to make amends, I will fecure my 2 companions as foon as may be. He whofe hand this fhall appear to be, will, I hope, be entitled to reward and his pardon. End quote. As Wilfon knew this letter to be of Simpson's handwriting, he thought himfelf juftified in making a full difcovery, which he accordingly did, in confequence of which his associates were apprehended at their lodgings in the Old Bailey 2 days afterwards. At firft they made an appearance of refiftance, and threatened to fhoot the peace officers, but the latter faying they were provided with arms, the offenders yielded, and were committed to Newgate. On the trial, Hawkins endeavoured to prove that he was in London at the time the mail was robbed, and when Fuller, of Bedfordbury, swore he lodged at his houfe that night. To ascertain this, Fuller produced a receipt for 30 fhillings, which he said Hawkins then paid him for horfe hire. The judge, desiring to look at that receipt, obferved that the body of it was written in an ink of a different colour from that of the name at the bottom, on which he ordered the note to be handed to the jury, and remarked that Fuller's testimony deferved no kind of credit. After examining fome other witnefles, the judge proceeded to fum up the evidence, in which he was interrupted by a fingular occurrence, which will be beft understood by giving it in the words of the short-hand writer. My ink, as it happened, was very bad, being thick at the bottom, and thin and waterifh at the top, and fo that accordingly, as I dipped my pen, the writing appeared very pale or very black. Now, juft as the court was remarking on the difference in ink in Fuller's receipt, a gentleman who stood by me, perceiving fomething of the fame kind in my writing, desired to look upon my notes for a minute, As I was not aware of any ill consequence, I let him take the book out of my hand, when presently, shewing it to his friend, "See here," said he, "what difference there is in the colour of the ink." His friend took it and shewed it to another. Uneasy at this, I spoke to them to return my book. They begged my pardon, and said I should have it in a minute. But this answer was no sooner given than a curiosity suddenly entered one of the jurymen who sat just by, and he too begged a sight of the book, which, notwithstanding my importunity, was immediately handed to him. He viewed it, and gave it to the next, and so it passed from one to another, till the judge, perceiving them very busy, called to them, "Gentlemen, what are you doing? What is that book?" They told him it was the writer's book, and they were observing how the fame ink appeared pale in one place and black in another. "You ought not, gentlemen," says he, "take notice of any thing but what is produced in evidence," and then, turning to me, demanded what I meant by shewing that to the jury. I answered that I could not fix upon the persons, for the gentlemen near me were all strangers to me, and I was far from imagining that I should have any occasion for taking particular notice of them. His lordship then reassumed his charge to the jury, which being ended, they withdrew to consider of their verdict. After staying out about an hour, the jury returned into court without agreeing on a verdict, saying they could not be convinced that Fuller's receipt was not genuine, merely on account of the different colours of the ink. In answer hereto, the court intimated how many witnesses had sworn that Hawkins was absent from London, to contradict all of whom there was only the evidence of Fuller, which was at least rendered doubtful by the ink appearing of two colours, and it was submitted whether Fuller's single testimony ought to be held of equal validity with that of all the oppofing parties. Hereupon the jury went out of court, and on their return gave a verdict of guilty against both the prisoners. After fentence of death, they behaved as became persons in their unfortunate circumstances. Simpson in particular appeared to be highly affected with the awfulness of his situation. At the place of execution, Hawkins addressed the surrounding multitude, acknowledging that his fins had brought him to that fhameful end, profeffing to die in charity with all mankind, and begging the prayers of thofe who were witnesses of his melancholy exit. He died with great difficulty, but Simpson was out of his pain almost without a ftruggle. Account of the trial of Margaret Fisher for privately stealing, with the fingular evidence given against her. In September, 1722, Margaret Fisher was indicted at the Old Bailey for privately stealing 13 guineas from the person of Daniel Macdonald. As our readers have a claim upon us for matters of entertainment as well as instruction, we are ready to gratify them, as we always shall be, when it can be done without grossly violating the laws of decency. And we insert the following for the fake of the whimsical singularity of the prosecutor's evidence, which was delivered in the following terms: "And leek your lairdship, I had just taken my wages, 13 guineas in good, and was gone along King Street in Westminster, when I met with this faux quean at the bar, and she spurred me where I was gone. I towed her hame. She said, Jen, I would ga with her till Johnny Davis's house. She would give me a dram, sir, for, in truth, she took me for a poor gawky boss-headed cheel, and leek your lairdship, she took my hood on my hand, and lad me a get I kenna real weel. And when we came to Johnny Davis's house, she called for mickle beer and brandy, and guard me as bung as a swobe, and leak, your honour. I stayed there with her a pratty while, and than, sir, I put my hand into my bricks to feel for money to pay the rackning. But the deal a bobby could I find for it was a tint. And when I speered about it, they glowered and told me gen I wanna tack myself a warn. They wad me ga with a deal to me. They dang me so sair and turned me out at the back door into the straat, and I rambled about and could not find the hoose again. And the watchman mat with me and carried me into the ruined house, and there I told em who I had been robbed. The next morning I gaed on foot out Junie Davis's house, but she was rin away, and the prisoner too. But at neat about 7 o'clock I met with this impudent batch at the bar, and took her up. I ken real weel enough that she must ha my good, for na Sal also was with me, but Johnny Davis wa brought what we called for. Let her deny it an she can. Somebody, but I kenna what it was, offered me 6 guineas in my hand to make the matter up, but I would not tak it. In her defence, the prisoner alleged that, meeting with a coachman and the prosecutor, the former asked her to drink, on which they went to the house of Mrs. Davis, but that she sat on the opposite side of the room that the prosecutor did, and had not robbed him, and that nothing was found upon her when she was searched. But the jury not believing her allegations, and as she had no persons to appear in behalf of her character, she was found guilty and received sentence of death. However, she pleaded that she was with child, and a jury of matrons finding this to be the fact, she had the good fortune to be respited and afterwards pardoned. The end of Part 7, Volume 1 of the new and complete Newgate Calendar.